Have you ever wondered why, when you get into a crowd, there seems to be a level of energy, a level of excitement that is unmatched like anything? You go to a sporting event and somebody scores a touchdown, somebody scores a goal, whatever sport it is, and something happens and there's just a wave of energy that hits you. Well, the phenomena that I'm talking about is probably best well explained in this book right here, The Crowd by Gustave Le Bon. Hopefully I said that right. I probably didn't. I don't speak French, so please yell at me in the comments. But the reason I picked up this book was because I was reading Propaganda by Edward Bernays, I want to say a week or two ago, and I found it fascinating. I found it horrifying but very interesting at the same time. And essentially, Edward Bernays, the nephew of Freud, was advocating that people needed to be propagandized because crowds are stupid and crowds don't know what they need to think. And if you have somebody kind of compelling them in the right direction, then you could have the right sort of ideas imparted. And it's a very utilitarian Machiavellian argument that I don't necessarily agree with. I obviously see the necessity for it in some means, but I don't think it's right. And I expected to get that from this book as well. But this book was really interesting. The only thing that I can really compare this to is Carl Jung, in the sense that these insights make sense instantly. Like the moment you read this, you're like, that makes so much sense, and that explains so much as to human behavior. And, you know, interestingly enough, I researched it, and Jung somewhat agreed with what Le Bon said about crowds and some of the things that he was talking about. But I was really taken aback with this book, and it took me several days to read, even though it was very short. And this is just simply for the fact that it was so, like, it hit the nail on the head, and I had to put the book down and start thinking about what it had to say. And essentially, we can boil down the entire book to the idea that crowds do not operate as human beings operate. Crowds operate as an amalgamation of every single person in the crowd and takes the average intelligence of that crowd, the average traits of that crowd. So, essentially you might have a crowd of all of these intelligent people, but they're operating at such a lower level simply because they have to somewhat agree. This person's opinion has to correlate with this person's opinion, so you get a much lesser version. You almost get a compromised version of what these people believe. And it's super fascinating to look at it in this way, because you look at some of the things that have happened throughout history and you're like, how could a group of people have done this? You look at riots, you look at revolutions, you look at, people just going crazy for no reason, and you're like, this doesn't make any sense. But in fact, it makes so much sense, because when you're in a crowd, you have a base instinct. You're not operating from a conscious mind. You're operating from an unconscious mind. You're operating from these lower impulses that are normally held back by your more rational senses. But because you're in this crowd, because you're protected by this crowd, all of those negative impulses, all of those, I should break this window, I should throw this chair, I should do this, I should do this horrible thing, is justified because you don't have that rationality, because you're operating from your nervous system or your spinal cord, as Le Bon says, instead of operating from your mind. And it's super interesting to think of things in this way, because you can see people act completely out of character once they go out into a bar, once they go out into a sporting event, or really anywhere that people are gathered. And it was also interesting to see that Le Bon really put these ideas of crowds to a simple definition of: a crowd is a group of people gathered for a specific reason. Because it's not just group behavior in the sense of, like, you're walking down the street and there's a lot of people and they all act congruent. It's when people are gathered for a specific reason, that's where their behavior somewhat syncs up. And there's all sorts of really interesting ideas in this book, but perhaps the most interesting, obviously, Le Bon was from France, so he had a great interest in Napoleon. And really, some of the most interesting stuff that I've ever heard about Napoleon is that Napoleon almost had a magnetism to him that allowed him to dictate the whims of the crowd, that allowed him to kind of take over the country after his return from Elba without even lifting a sword, without even firing a weapon, without even having to fight. He walked in front of the soldiers who said they would, get rid of him on sight. But instead of doing that, they laid down their swords, they laid down their arms, and again allowed Napoleon to become the leader of France. And it's so fascinating to, study people like this and study minds like this. There are some negative implications of this book. Le Bon kind of leaves these generalities and these ideas out there, and it's up to you to do with them what you want. So this is why you have people like Edward Bernays, who are more Machiavellian, who are more, I'm going to lead people in a certain way, I'm going to force and compel certain actions. And it's quite unfortunate. I think this is really the negative aspect to any interesting idea, any psychological idea, is that there's going to be Machiavellian, there's going to be dark triad people that use these ideas to their advantage and kind of do things that they really shouldn't do. But, you know, the thing that struck me the most, and the thing that I probably agree with the most from this book, is the idea that revolutions never solve anything. Revolutions just solve the anger of the crowd. They just get rid of that brashness and that need for change, but then it resets to something completely congruent with what was just in power. And I think Le Bon doesn't necessarily see revolutions as a change of the guard. It's just a change of the titles, and that's something that's always struck me. That's something that I've always seen in that. You know, think about the French Revolution. The French Revolution was trying to create everything to be equal, and in creating everything to be equal, there were millions of people who became political prisoners and political victims just in the name of freedom. And it's like somewhat ironic that you overthrow a tyrannical king to create an even more tyrannical democracy. And it's just, there's so many fascinating elements to this book, and it's always interesting when you talk about these psychological concepts and you kind of take them in a bird's eye view. And, you know, one of the most fascinating things that I also took away from this book was the idea of history, the idea of legend, the idea of how crowds are not accurate, how crowds can somewhat warp perception simply because one person said it, and since one person accepted it, the crowd accepted it, and because the crowd accepted it, it became a history, it became fact. And there's all sorts of myths that prove this legend, or myths that prove this idea, such as, think of Achilles heel, and all sorts of ideas about the Greek epic hero. I'm trying to think of the words to describe him, but like Achilles probably was a real person, but his stories are probably put to this mythic level because you had X amount of people witness him do something really, really interesting, something really, really cool, something really heroic, and it shifted from this guy is just a great soldier to this guy is a legend, this guy will forever be part of Greek history simply because X amount of people saw this idea, accepted this idea, and created this mythos. This is how you see myths are built as well for Alexander the Great, for Caesar, for Napoleon, for various other figures throughout history. And overall, I very much recommend this book. I thought it was really, really well put together, and there were very few parts that I would say I disagreed with, but obviously I'm an individual. If I don't disagree with something you say, then I'm not an individual. I'm just a robot. But yeah, very much recommend reading this. Very fun read, very interesting read, and it gets to the depths of the human psyche, especially the psyche of the crowd, like no other book I've ever understood or no other book that I've ever read. And you're going to learn a lot from it. You're going to see a lot of patterns. And the next time you watch the news, you're going to see how these ideas are being put into action, because you had people like Edward Bernays who basically modernized the idea of public relations and basically instituted all of these systems of control of the mind and stuff, and he was very much inspired by Gustave Le Bon. So for good or bad, this book is affecting you. And you know, I always like to say it's best to arm yourself with the information that people are using against you so that you cannot be taken advantage of. I think that's really the best way to arm yourself and adapt to this world, and just understand, like, why are you thinking something? Why is this something you believe? And if you can't get to the bottom of it, if you can't look at the other side and see their perspective, see their side of things, see why they're arguing things, then you're probably controlled, and you're probably part of some sort of idea that you otherwise wouldn't accept, but because it's been repeated enough times, you will agree with it. And that's another part of the book that it talked about, that if you really want to impart a message to a crowd, you just repeat it enough times and it becomes like a statue. It becomes stagnant in the minds of the crowd. So yeah, think about these things, read this book, arm yourself with these ideas, and don't be controlled. That's really what I got for you guys today. With that said, love you guys so much. Peace out. I'll catch you in the next one.